1793, the French, country of France, instituted, they legislated for their entire country what was they called French Revolutionary Time. So how we have right now Central Standard Time, next week turns over to Central Daylight Savings Time. They called it French Revolutionary Time. And their attempt was to switch from our current system even today of 24 hours in a day, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. They switched to 10-hour days with 100 minutes per hour and 100 seconds per minute. So they were trying to be decimal-based in how they measured time. That would get confusing after you've lived with our current system, as you can imagine. But you can also see potentially why they would choose to do that, make it a little more functional, a little more appealing in terms of math and how we measure time. But that would make noon at 5 o'clock, right? Kind of interesting, kind of weird to think about. Well, it only lasted 17 months. They put it into place in 1793. They did away with it in April 1795. Didn't work, didn't go over well. And weirdly enough, about 100 years later, these same people, the French, tried to take a 24-hour day and turn it into 100-minute hours and 100-second minutes. They just have this fascination with trying to force time into being decimal-based. What's interesting, though, for us is that no matter how we measure time, we always wish there was a little bit more of it. Do we not? See, we say the phrase, time is valuable. And we even said the phrase, time is money. But how often do we view our 24-hour days or our 168-hour weeks as though it were money, as though it were valuable, as though it were something of great value? Do we care for each hour, each block of 30 minutes as we would a $1 bill or a $10 bill or a $100 bill? Do we treat time as though it's valuable? Are we consistent, at least, maybe is the better question, in treating, viewing time as if it's valuable? See, when we go to a doctor's office, and it takes 2 or 3 or 4 hours to sit in the waiting room, our time is valuable. When we go to a restaurant and we wait 30 extra minutes on our food or on our drink, that time is valuable. Our time is valuable. Time is money. But sometimes we plop down in front of the TV, and 2 and 3 and 4 hours later, we wonder where it went. Is time valuable then? We introduced this idea a little bit last week. If I had more, fill in the blank, I would do more for the Lord, for others. If I had more time, I would study the Bible more. If I had more time, I would go visit those in need more. If I had more time, I would do more for the Lord. And so this morning we want to really kind of have a simple task, and that is to try to allow us and open our minds, challenge our hearts to simply view time as how God views time. Do we view it the way the Bible teaches us to view it? Are our hearts in alignment with how God has created time and gives us time? One truth about time is that it is limited. Time is limited. Just as a stack of money is limited. It's only has so much in it. It has a ceiling. It has a beginning and it has an end. Our bank accounts only have so much in them. No matter how big the number, it's limited, right? Time is limited. There's only so much of it. You thought about this, that in almost every area of life, there's a limit to time. We could probably argue that in marriage and friendships, those last for the ends of our lives. But when we watch a sporting event, there's a limit to the time. A game lasts X number of minutes, or X number of innings, X number of periods or halves, right? When we watch TV shows or movies or songs, there's a finite amount of time that those last. They don't keep going on and on and on. Despite that kid's song, that this is the song that never ends, it still ends. It's still limited, right? We have 18 to 20 years to raise our children to be adults before they are adults. We have so many years of our, quote, working life before we plan for retirement. Time is limited. But secondly, when we think about time being valuable, trying to help us to see how God would have us to view time, we also see that we spend all of our time. We spend all of our time doing something. We can't save time, put back time for later. We spend it doing something. It'd be nice to have a time savings account. When we get into a car accident on the way to work, we can cash that time out and say, hold up, I've got 3 more years in this account. Don't take me just yet. See, we would love to think about time in that way, but we can't. It's limited, and we'll spend it all doing something. See, this 168 hours in this week that's ahead. I guess technically it's 167 this week, interestingly enough, with daylight savings time coming up. But we'll spend those hours doing something. Some combination of sleeping, of eating, of working, of spending time with family, of entertainment. We'll spend it doing something. And so if we recognize we're going to spend it all, we can't save it up, we can't put it back for later. If we're going to spend it all, obviously that puts a premium on the somethings. That puts great value on what it is we choose to do with the somethings. Choose to spend it on. And so this morning, as we try to think about this, our goal is not to break down our schedules and to talk about time management tips and all that. There'll be a time and a place that we can study that later perhaps. But our goal is simply to feel the weight of knowing that our time is limited. Knowing that God has created time, and it's a wonderful thing. But how we use the time will determine our faithfulness to God, our relationship to Him, and our ability to serve other people. Zig Ziglar said, "You show me your calendar and your checkbook, then I'll tell you what's most important in your life." This morning, as we look at a couple of passages, one from the New Testament, one from the Old Testament, we simply want to ask that question, not simply, what am I going to do with my time? But who decides? Who decides what gets done and what does not get done? I ran across this quote in the past week, and there's probably billions of other quotes like it. This is just the one that I ran across. But the question isn't, how can we do it all? The question isn't, can I fit everything in my schedule? But the question is, who gets to decide? Who's answering? Who's deciding for how we manage our time? See, it's easy in our society to answer to everyone else, to try to impress other people, to try to please other people. We allow sometimes other people to take advantage of us, perhaps. And our time is gone before we know it. So do we choose how we manage our time, or do we allow other people to choose our time for us? But most importantly, as Christians, we have no choice but to view time and to treat time with God in the picture, and with God deciding. So when we stand here and we look at our time, we try to recognize that it's valuable, and that if we're going to build relationships with God, or we're going to build a relationship with each other, that it's going to happen when there's margin, when there's extra, as we introduced last week. Are we allowing Him? Are we allowing His perspective, His eternal perspective, to fuel our decisions as we live within a world designed with time? Let's go to James 4. James chapter 4. Let's begin reading verse 13. "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." This passage is powerful on a number of different levels. And it's especially interesting in light of James' really overall approach throughout the book. He's constantly addressing this tension between earthly, worldly wisdom, wisdom that's from below, compared to God's wisdom which comes from above? Are we choosing to live each and every single day, not just Sundays, not just Wednesday nights? Are we choosing to live every single day dependent upon God's wisdom and what He offers to us? That's James' point throughout the entire book. And so see how this passage intersects with that point of James, the point he's making. We can live in a world in which we presume, a world in which we think we have it all figured out, a world in which we try to make all the decisions based solely on ourselves and our wants and our desires and our needs. And yet James argues for dependence on God. James argues for godly wisdom, spiritual wisdom. And here he shows us an example of how we can fall prey to that earthly wisdom, that earthly way of living. Did you notice in his example, the person who's saying this decides everything about his trip? He decides the day he's going tomorrow. He decides where he's going. He decides what he's going to do there. He decides the length of time. He even decides the result. Hey, I'm going to be successful over there. I'm going to make a profit. There was no room whatsoever in this hypothetical scenario for God. And he says, you who make a practice of doing this, you're acting on earthly wisdom because you're not consulting God. And he introduces that idea by giving them a foundational truth. That time is limited. That time is short. You see that? You contrast it, verse 14. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. You act this way, you speak this way, you plan this way, and yet you do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. Because of what principle? Because of this principle. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. So then he illustrates. James is marvelous at illustrating, using these word pictures. He says, life is short. Time is limited. You know how limited time is, he says? It's limited just like that fog, that mist that appears. You see it, but then it's gone. We see it sometimes with our fog in our area. We also can see it on a cold day. We breathe and our breath is visible for just a moment and it's gone. You can illustrate this with our children really well this week, can we not? Because that snow was here, and it was beautiful, and it was real, but how much of it do we have left? One of the kids on our street, in fact, on Thursday, I guess it was, the second day, she said, I wish it all wouldn't melt away. I wish we had more snow. Don't want to be timed that way? I wish we had a little more. I wish it hadn't flown by. I wish my kids weren't grown yet. I wish I wasn't as old as I am. And James says that principle is at the heart of the problem you're facing when you make plans, when you view time as though God is not a part of your time. It's limited. It's here, and then it's gone. It's here, and then it goes elsewhere. But then notice what happens in verse 15. He introduces the truth. He says, instead, you ought to say this. So introducing truth to the scenario changes the heart, changes our approach, it changes our attitude. He says, instead, you ought to say this. If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. If the Lord allows us to, if the Lord would have us to do this, we're going to include the Lord in our thinking and in our planning and in our praying. And we'll do our best to do this or that. So that it's transformational truth to recognize time is limited, and thus we need to be using it, investing it, spending it with God in mind. In verse 16, he really gets in our face. He introduces these principles. Maybe we're following along and we're like, yeah, okay, James, I'm with you. Maybe I should say that more often. Lord willing, the Lord wills. Okay. Then he gets right up in our face and shows us how serious this is in verse 16. As it is, though, you boast in your arrogance. So he says, for me to operate as though time is guaranteed, to say, I'm going to do this, we're going to do this. He calls that arrogance. He says it's arrogant to assume that any length of time is guaranteed. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. It's here and then it vanishes. And so for us to presume that it's guaranteed and that there's something that's always going to last physically is arrogance. That's powerful. Because we live in a fleshly world, and so it's easy for us to think, well, this is always going to be here. I'm always going to be here. These blessings are always going to be here. And yet, we're constantly caught off guard. When life is cut short. When things are cut short. When things are taken away from us. James says it's arrogant to plan life, to view life as though it's guaranteed. Time as though it's guaranteed. But then he goes one step further in verse 17. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. We talk about that verse sometimes. We often kind of forget the so at the beginning of the verse, or the therefore that's in some translations. It's because of this paragraph and this principle that James makes this statement. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him, it is sin. See, it's wise to plan. You read the book of Proverbs, you read the words of Jesus, it's a wise thing to do to plan. But it's sinful for the Christian to plan as though God doesn't exist, as though God has no influence upon our lives. And I'll be honest, typing this out, getting PowerPoint ready, getting the outline ready, I was trying to find a way to kind of weasel out of this principle. Are we sure it's sinful or not? But James says it is. For us to live daily as though God has no influence and no part of our life, even though we claim to be his children, James says it's wrong. It's sinful. It calls our soul into question if we're going to live life as though God has no part in it. When we've said that we have given our lives to him. So we view time, do we view time as though God views time? Do we view it as though it's limited, that he's given it to us? Do we recognize it's a good thing to involve him in our plans? And that to forget him has eternal implications? Think about verse 17 also and how we introduced this series last week and have already alluded to today. We say, if I had more, fill in the blank, I would do more for the Lord. If I had more time, I would study the Bible, I would evangelize, I would be at church more often and worship more often. If I had more time, I would do this. What's James say in 4 verse 17? I know to do good, but for whatever reason, I don't do it. Where's my relationship with God? If I know it's the right thing to do, but I don't do it, he says, it's the same as sin. Do we view time as though it's limited, and that God gives it to us to do his will within it? Are we consulting God as we view our time? Let's go over back to the Old Testament, to Psalm chapter 90, Psalm number 90. These are the words of Moses, Psalm 90. Let's just begin reading verse 1. We'll allow Moses to kind of set up his own words. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. So just a few verses in, we see this contrast between God's nature and God's character and man's nature and man's character. And one of the ways that Moses explains this contrast is to show our relationship to time. We recognize that we are bound by time, that it's limited in this life. But he says about God, you're everlasting to everlasting. You're forever in both directions. 1,000 years is just like yesterday to you. We're bound by time. We're limited by time. For time is nothing to you, God. You created us and you created time. Look at how majestic you are compared to our existence. So verse 5, you sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. So alluding to those 1,000 years once again. They're swept away as with a flood. They're just like a dream. 1,000 years to God. Poof. It just happens. Like grass. It's beautiful and it fades. Verse 7, for you brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath, and we bring our years to an end like a sigh. Moses' realization that our lives, our sin has complicated our lives. Our lives are short, our lives can be painful because we're fleshly, because we sinned. God's character is perfect, and that contrast is evident. So then look at what he says in verse 10. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So here Moses introduces some very similar principles to those that James introduces back in James 4. Time is limited. Moses says, we only have so many years that we can live. And it's interesting, Moses lived beyond that 70 to 80 years. But he says, we only have so many years in which to live. And a lot of those are difficult. They're tough. They're painful. They're soon gone. So here Moses highlighting how short time can be, how short it feels. And then notice he connects that to God. Verse 11. Who considers the power of your anger, your wrath, according to the fear of you, the respect, the acknowledgement that you're perfect, God, and we're sinful. How can we look to your nature and see that you are perfect? That time does not bind you, God, and it binds us. It's limited in our lives. You're perfect and we're sinful. So what shall we do? So then we turn to verse 12. The key verse, the magic verse, if you will. Verse 12. So, therefore, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. See the connection? Very similar things to those that James introduced. Teach us to view time as you would have us to view it, so that our hearts may be wise, so that we will make decisions in this life that are the best decisions we can make. The best decisions for you, for us, in light of our relationship with you. Teach us to count, to consider, to number, to keep track of our days, so that our heart can continue to develop into that of wisdom. So then look at the result, verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Isn't that what we want? We want God to be a part of our lives, us to be a part of God's mission, God's purposes. And Moses says, teach us to treat time like you treat time. Teach us to count our days, to track our time, so that we can develop a heart that pleases and serves you, so that you will continue to bless us in our lives. Verse 14 connects the two. That we may rejoice and be glad all our days. See, if we count our days, we number our days, we track our time, we look at our time as though God would have us to look at it, intentionally, with purpose, with humility, we gain the heart of wisdom. We rejoice, we're glad our days, because we begin our time with God in mind. Can you imagine, practically speaking, the impact if we kind of wrote down our daily schedule, just being honest with ourselves and just wrote it down, then pass it kind of to the person to our left or right. We might help each other a little bit, could we not? Maybe you can see some things in my schedule where time's kind of wasted, and I can see some things in some of yours or whatnot. We can have a little bit of a fresh perspective if we're not always looking at our own lives. But what if we step back and all have the courage to simply say, God, I want you to look at my schedule. I want you to help me plan my schedule. Doesn't that make a lot of sense? That's exactly what James is telling us to do. Plan with God in mind. And I think poetically here in Psalm number 90, Moses says that. God, help us to see time as you see time. To have a heart that views time as though it's limited. Doesn't it make sense to allow God to help us with our calendars? Because is it not God who has given us our time? Who better than to help us to manage our time? To think humbly about our time than the one who's given it to us? And also, who better to help us with our time and with our calendars and our schedules than the one who knows how much time we have left? If we recognize time is limited and that we don't know what tomorrow will bring, if we don't know what tomorrow holds, then why would we put our time in the hands of anyone else other than the one who holds tomorrow? Moses says, teach us to count, to track, to view time with you in mind. Practically, we kind of wind down here. This week, one simple suggestion, one simple task for us is we try to develop a little margin so that we can use our time to serve God. If I had more time, I would do more good, more of the Lord's work. Let's just start with this, though. What if every time we put on our watch, that morning time we put on our watch, or maybe younger generation, you put your cell phone in your pocket or your bag. If we just said that simple prayer, Lord, teach me to count my days. Teach me to count my time, to track my time, to view my time with wisdom, the way you've designed me to live in this day. What if every time throughout the day you check your watch, you check your phone to see what time it is? Help me to count my days. Help me to have the heart of wisdom so that I can best serve you and have this relationship with you. And the best question for all of us right now in this moment is, how are we going to use the next few minutes that God gives us? Maybe word that prayer silently in your head, especially if you know things are not right with you and God. Help me to use these next few minutes with wisdom. Help me to make sure my life is right with you, God. To respond to this invitation. It's open around the clock. Any of us will meet you here to baptize you at any time of the day or night. We'd love to help you, baptize you for the remission of your sins today, this hour. Any of us are willing to sit down and pray with you and talk with you and help you. We'd love to help you this hour. If you need to respond to the Lord in the time that's given to you right now, do so as we stand and sing together.